Welcome back. Do you want to learn something new today? A couple years ago I learned about this editing technique where if you take lots of landscape photos, especially during golden hour or in the evenings the way I do, it gives your images that soft painting look that you may not always get out of a digital photo because of the sharpness that comes with the lenses and the sensors nowadays. I learned it as called the Orton Effect. And after trying it on a few of my own images, I now use it on nearly every single image that I edit as well. But depending on the actual image, I may not apply it to the whole one. I'll just apply it to parts of the image and keep some parts to make sure they have all the detail that I want it to have. But it varies. The good thing with this editing technique is you can add it to all of your photos and you won't lose a significant amount of noticeable detail in your photos as well. What it does is it accentuates the colors that are already there, but it gives it that soft look that you won't get out of an image because everything is perfectly sharp. But it makes it look a little bit more like a very, very detailed painting. There may be other ways you can apply the same technique in your photo editing software, such as reducing the sharpening or reducing the texture and the clarity. But I found that applying this technique itself actually generates a much better result, and that's why I've remained using it over the past few years to nearly all of my images, as you'll see. I do have to say that you do need Photoshop if you do want to apply this technique, because I don't know how you could apply it in Lightroom since they do have masking, but I have found it's not the same. And I'm not familiar enough with other photo editing software to say whether you can or cannot do it. But since I use Photoshop to do most of my finishing touches and quite a bit of my editing as well, we'll jump into Photoshop in a second and I'll show you exactly how it is you can apply this technique, and if you wanted to apply it to the whole image, or as I'll show you, in some parts of the image only as well. And you don't have to follow the exact process I do to a T. It comes down to the type of picture you've taken, your editing style, and naturally your personal preference as well. So let's jump on the computer and I'll show exactly how I've used this technique in a few photos where I've applied it to the whole image, but also a few cases where I haven't applied it to the whole image. Here's the first nearly finished photo from the last time I went to Bradley's Head. This photo is a good example of applying this technique to the whole image because it has a very muted look due to the clouds covering most of the sunset. I should quickly preface this by saying that the way I organize everything in Photoshop does help to keep all the files and the layers organized. So that way, if I ever wanted to go back and do a few tweaks or a few edits, it's easy to know exactly which layer is which, versus trying to play some guesswork or going through the layers one by one to try and find the layer I need. As you can see, all of the layers are grouped, and they even have groups inside the groups as well, so that I know exactly what it is I need to look for. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this group, and then I'm going to merge it. Now, before we do any edits, I'm going to make this a smart object as well. So what I'll do is I'll actually make a duplicate layer, and then I'm going to make this one a smart object instead. And I'll show you why I prefer using smart objects over just a regular layer in Photoshop once we finish editing this initial photo, because then you'll see how having it as a smart object can sometimes come in handy versus not having it as a smart object. But it's completely up to you as to whichever way you prefer doing this. So let's turn off the smart object for now. So this is the merged layer. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to apply a Gaussian blur to it. So to do that, we're going to go up to Filter and Blur, and then Gaussian blur. This window pops up letting you know how many pixels of the radius the blur would be. From the advice I've seen is that the number of pixels for the radius should be based on how many megapixels your camera sensor is. As my Canon is 30 megapixels, that's why I've got the 30 here. If you've got like the Canon R5, it should be 45, and if you've got the Sony A7R4, it should be 60 or 61, and so on and so forth. But you can play around with whatever pixels you want it to be based on what the finished product is. But as I found that using the 30 pixels for my 30 megapixels has come out quite well, we'll stick with that in this case. So we'll hit OK. And as you can see, that is now very, very blurry. But now we're going to boost up the contrast, the vibrance, and the saturation. So to do that, we're going to go to Filter and Camera Raw Filter. Or you can use the keyboard shortcut Control-Shift-A if you so prefer as well. You can play around with the different levels for the contrast, the saturation, and the vibrance to find a happy medium for yourself. I found if you stick anywhere between the 70 to 85 range for all three of those sliders, that seems to get the best effect. So we'll just keep it at 70 for this example, and then you can see exactly how it's going to look after that. Yes, I prefer typing the numbers in instead of sliding because that way I know I easily get a 70 out of that. Now, that looks like a right royal mess, doesn't it? So the way that we'll blend it into the photo now is we'll drop the opacity of this layer down to aim for about the 10 to 15% range depending on the image. You can play around with it quite easily. Just for example purposes for this video, I'm going to keep it at 15% so you can actually see the difference. Because if I dropped it down to 10 or 11% like I normally do, it may not actually show up and then you'll be thinking, what the heck is Pien showing me? I've got no idea what I'm looking at. So I'll keep it at 15% just so we can actually see exactly what's going on. So 15%. So here is the final image with the technique applied. So this is the image with it on. This is the image with it off. As you can see, there's a subtle difference. It's a little bit noticeable, but not overly standing out. That's why it's just softens the image a little bit. So that's it with it on again. And I'll zoom in a little bit, let's say to up here in the sky so you can actually see where the biggest difference is. So that's with it on, that's with it off. And one more time, that's with it on. You can see how the sky's a bit softer, the colors are a bit brighter, but they're also a bit more blended, and that's with it off. Now, you may remember earlier I mentioned that I prefer using these layers as smart objects versus just layers, and I'll show you why now, because as you've seen, we've already applied the changes to this layer, but if for whatever reason I wanted to go and adjust those sliders, because this is a standard layer, I can't. So if we went back up to filter and camera raw filter, all it's done is it's just open it up, but as you can see, the sliders are all at 0, which means that if I wanted to make changes, I would have to start doing guesswork to be like, okay, it was plus 70. If I wanted to get it to 85, do I go plus 15 or is it plus 15 based on where it already is? And it's a nightmare. Whereas if I was to use this layer instead, so this is a smart object layer, we'll do the same thing. We'll add a blur first. Gaussian blur, exactly the same pixels. But you see here underneath it's now got a Gaussian blur. And then if I went up to filter and camera raw filter, and I'll just quickly apply the same effects to it. So we've got the same effect. I'll drop it down to the 15% again so you can see the difference. But if now I wanted to change any of those sliders for whatever reason, I can double click on camera raw filter. It'll bring the filter up and all of the sliders are still at exactly the same spot I left it. Because it's a smart object, it still lets you make modifications based on where you last left it versus having to start all over again. So by doing it this way, it just makes any future edits a lot easier than having to redo the whole process. And the same goes for the Gaussian blur. I can now go in and change the pixels if I wanted to change it to 50 as an example. And let's dial this one up a bit more. So let's put this right at 100%. It still looks very blurry, but if we dropped it down to 15 again, and let's go back up to the sky. You can see that it's still there, but it's now much more blurred and much softer. So it's got too much of that soft look, and I'd be worried that it would take away too much of the detail. And I think that's why they said, if your camera senses 30 megapixels, make the radius 30 pixels, because in that way, at least it's all nicely blended together. And now you can see exactly, it does look a little bit better compared to at 50. It's subtle but noticeable. I'll show you another image where this was applied so you can see it again. This one's from Katu Falls when I used this technique, and because this whole area was under the tree canopy and it was an overcast day, and even though I exposed to make sure that it wasn't too dark and too many shadows, I still want to give it that muted look because of the fact it was an overcast day and it was under the tree canopy, so there wasn't that much direct light. So we'll do the exact same process here where I'll duplicate this group. So now we'll merge that group. And then we'll do the same technique. We'll go filter, blur, Gaussian blur, keep it to that same 30 pixels. Then we'll go filter again and camera raw filter. And again, I'll just apply the same levels of 70 each to the contrast, the vibrance, and the saturation. And we'll drop this opacity down to about 15% again so you can see the differences. Where are we? Actually, let's zoom in a little bit so you can actually see the difference. So here it is with the layer on, here it is with it off, there it is on again. And you can see, especially in the color of the water, how it looks a bit smoother, the colors are a bit more blended together, but you still kept quite a bit of the details in the rocks and where the water is coming off the rocks as well. That's why I like using this technique, is because you get the benefit of the blended colors and that soft look, but you don't lose noticeable detail that someone could tell, oh, it's not sharp, oh, it's soft. It's a nice finishing touch that gives those images that soft painting look that you sometimes want out of a landscape image. I also mentioned there are cases where I don't apply this to the whole image, and that's because sometimes there's something in the image and particular subject where I don't want to lose any detail. I want all the detail to be there, and I want all the sharpness to be there. So we'll jump back on and I'll show you a few examples of where I haven't applied it to the whole image. I won't apply the technique, I'll just show you how I've made sure that the whole image hasn't been affected. So the first one is from Camp Cove. And if you look here on the right, you can see for the one that has the filter on it, I've got a mask next to it. And so this mask makes sure that this effect has been applied to the whole image, except for the shed, the walkway, and these rocks here in the foreground. And that's because I deliberately wanted those to stay sharp. I didn't want them to lose anything at all, and I didn't want the colors to affect it either. I wanted the colors and the water of the sky and the background to be muted and a bit soft, but I wanted the shed and the rocks to stand out, and so that's why I deliberately left those parts out of this particular technique. You could apply it if you wanted to, it's completely up to you, but my intent behind it was to keep those sharp and keep everything else have that nice soft look. So if I press the backslash button on the keyboard, you can see the red shows exactly where this filter hasn't been applied to the image. I can't tell you, it wasn't easy painting around all those rocks and trying to make sure I got the rocks and not the water, or where it all blended together, because this was like a 2-minute exposure sort of thing. Here's another case where I've only used it in part of the image as well. This was from Turmeda Beach, and I wanted to make sure that the rocks and the water had separation from it in both detail, color, and look, because I wanted the rocks to stay nice and sharp, but I wanted the water to look nice and soft because it was a longer exposure. This was just shy of half a second roughly. So if I do the same thing and I hit backslash on the keyboard, but you can see how I've only applied it to part of the image, because those are the parts of the rocks where I wanted it to keep the detail, and the rest of it I was happy for it to have that soft painted look, so you got a bit of a blend and a bit of it stands out. And this is also another case where you could easily apply the technique to the whole image instead of just part of the image. It literally comes down to personal preference. So that's my take on the Orton effect. I hope you've been able to see a new editing technique here, and also a way that I've applied it and how you can apply it to your images as well. As I said earlier, you don't have to follow this exact process to a T. You can do this before you've done the rest of your edits if you like, if you use Photoshop a lot like I do. Or you can follow my process, which is you do it at the end of your editing process and use it as a finishing technique to finalize the image, so to speak. It's completely up to you. If you do have any questions about this technique or any other photo editing techniques as well, I should say, please leave a comment down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you have liked this video and did find it useful, please do give it a thumbs up. That will be greatly appreciated. And if you want to make sure you know what's coming up in the next video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and tick that little bell. And I'll see you on the next one, because it's time to go out and take more photos. Have a good one.